The day Cardinal Wolsey handed over the Great Seal was a day of shattered expectations and burgeoning rage. Henry VIII, the once ambitious king, felt betrayed. His hopes for an annulment of his marriage to Catherine of Aragon had been cruelly dashed. Anne Boleyn, who had been optimistic about her future as queen, felt cheated yet again. Cardinal Wolsey, the king's most trusted adviser, was left to face the wrath of both the king and the Boleyn family, all because he had been outmaneuvered by his own colleagues. Wolsey's fall was swift and decisive. For years he had relied solely on the king's favor, and when that favor waned, his position became precarious. The nobles who had long resented Wolsey's influence over the king saw their chance. John Skelton, a poet in the pay of the Duke of Norfolk, had been criticizing Wolsey for years, accusing him of usurping the nobles' traditional roles. In the summer of 1527, it seemed the nobles had him cornered, but Wolsey managed to recover by promising the king a way to annul his marriage through the Rota, the papal court. Now, with that hope extinguished, Anne Boleyn, who had previously maintained a cordial relationship with Wolsey, turned against him. Wolsey's failure to take the Franco-imperial peace negotiations at Cambrai seriously only added to his troubles. England, which was technically a belligerent, was not represented at the conference, and by the time Wolsey sent a delegation, it was too late to influence the outcome. England's interests were ignored, and the diplomatic support that had been promised by the ongoing war was slipping away. On September 19, 1529, Wolsey and Campeggio, the papal legate, appeared at court. Henry dismissed them briefly, and then went hunting with Anne. 2 days later, Wolsey was ordered to surrender the Great Seal, and on October 9th he faced premunire charges. He confessed and was pardoned, but his rehabilitation was far from certain. In the midst of this turmoil, Lord Rochford, Anne Boleyn's brother, emerged as a key figure. He was part of the aristocratic group in the council, led by the Dukes of Norfolk and Suffolk, who were staunchly opposed to Wolsey. On October 8th, George Boleyn, Lord Rochford's son, was sent to France as an emissary, replacing Sir Francis Bryan. This move highlighted his growing influence within the council. On December 8th, Henry promoted a new batch of peers at Wolsey's former residence, York Place. George Hastings became Earl of Huntingdon, Robert Ratcliffe became Earl of Sussex, and Lord Rochford became Earl of Wiltshire and Ormond. These were all new men, promoted for their loyalty to Henry and their political alignment with the Boleyn faction. The elevation of Rochford to the earldom of Ormond was particularly significant, marking the end of a long legal and political dispute with Sir Piers Butler, who was given the earldom of Ossory instead. Henry, despite his disappointment, did not abandon his quest for an annulment. Pressured by Anne, he began to explore new strategies. He took advantage of the anti-clerical mood in the House of Commons to pass acts against probate and mortuary fees. He also sought the opinions of universities on his marriage. This idea was suggested by Thomas Cranmer, a Cambridge don, during a visit to Waltham Abbey. Henry was intrigued and summoned Cranmer to court, where he was instructed to write a treatise on the matter. Cranmer was then sent to live at the Earl of Wiltshire's house to complete his work. The treatise pleased Henry, and Cranmer was added to the team of advisors working to find a solution. They drew up a document known as the Collectanea Citis Copiosa, arguing that the king could seek a solution within his own realm, using the authority of the Archbishop of Canterbury. However, Henry was not yet ready to take such radical steps. He sent envoys to Rome to find evidence that ancient English customs exempted the king from papal authority, but this search proved fruitless. In May 1530, Henry convened a meeting of bishops and university representatives at St. Edward's Chapel in Westminster. He presented them with various theological works, including William Tyndale's New Testament, and lectured them on their preaching responsibilities. On June 22nd, he issued a proclamation condemning certain works as heretical, an act that infringed on the Church's traditional prerogatives. Embassies continued to be sent to plead Henry's case. George, Lord Rochford, attended a meeting between Pope Clement and Emperor Charles in Bologna, ostensibly to congratulate the emperor but primarily to pressure the Pope. In March, the Earl of Wiltshire led another mission to Rome, declaring that the king would insist on an annulment. Despite these efforts, the Pope remained unyielding. By 1531, the Boleyn family's influence was growing. Thomas Boleyn, now the Earl of Wiltshire, received letters directly from the English ambassador in Spain and was granted lands in Kent. He was also listed as one of the most influential counselors with the king. Thomas Cromwell, a former servant of Wolsey, had risen rapidly in Henry's favor and was closely aligned with the Boleyns, urging the king to take more decisive action. A legal challenge to Thomas Boleyn's claim to the Ormond title in Ireland required a search through the records of the Court of Common Pleas and the Petty Bag Office. The expenses were paid by the Crown, indicating the king's support. As Lord Privy Seal, Thomas was named to numerous commissions of the peace, although he likely did not participate in them. The Boleyn family, including Anne, George, Lord Rochford, his wife Jane, and his sister Mary, received gifts from the king at New Year 1532. As 1532 progressed, the Boleyn and Cromwell factions increased their efforts to challenge the papal jurisdiction. Tracts were published arguing that the papal claims were a human invention, and that the issue of the king's marriage should be settled by the Archbishop of Canterbury. Henry's patience was wearing thin, and the death of Archbishop William Warham in August provided the final impetus for action. The stage was set for a dramatic confrontation, and the king was almost ready to take the bold step that would change the course of English history. The King Henry VIII had made up his mind. After the death of Warham, the Archbishop of Canterbury, on August 22nd, he decided to appoint his own man to the position, defying the Pope. On September 1st, he elevated Anne Boleyn to the title of Marquis of Pembroke, a move that signified a significant shift in their relationship. This change was partly to prepare for an important meeting with Francis I of France, scheduled for October. Anne, who couldn't yet accompany the king as his queen, was given a prestigious peerage to ensure she had the necessary status for the occasion. The ceremony took place at Windsor, with the king, the Duke of Norfolk, the Duke of Suffolk, the Earl of Wiltshire, and the French ambassador in attendance. Anne was escorted by the Countesses of Rutland and Sussex, and the Bishop of Winchester, Stephen Gardiner, read the patent of creation. Anne's cousin, Mary, the Duchess of Richmond, carried her train. With this new title, Anne was granted precedence over all peers except the three dukes. Additionally, she received lands worth £1,000 a year, giving her financial independence for the first time. When Henry set off for the meeting with Francis I, Anne initially stayed behind to avoid offending Eleanor, Francis's second wife. However, when Francis visited Calais, he greeted Anne with the respect due to her new rank. This meeting was a show of alliance between England and France, aimed at demonstrating their unity and seeking support from the French cardinals to help Henry's cause with the Pope. However, Francis's support was not as solid as it seemed. He later arranged a marriage between his son and the Pope's niece, Catherine de Medici, to avoid conflict with the Vatican. Henry's confidence in his alliance with France grew, and he believed he could weather any storm caused by his actions. In Calais during a storm, Henry and Anne consummated their relationship. By Christmas 1532, Anne was treated like a queen, and the court was filled with a festive atmosphere. Henry showered her with gifts, including a vast amount of gilt and silver plate, and even showed her the royal treasure chamber, a closely guarded secret. In January 1533, Henry sent Thomas Cranmer, who was to become the next Archbishop of Canterbury, back from his mission in Germany. Thomas Audley, a supporter of the Boleyns, was given the Great Seal, and the council began working on a draft of the Act in Restraint of Appeals, which would limit the Pope's authority in England. Around this time, Anne was found to be pregnant, and plans for a royal wedding were set in motion. On February 7th, Anne's father, the Earl of Wiltshire, told the Earl of Rutland that the king was determined to marry Anne. Despite Rutland's initial resistance, he eventually yielded to the king's pressure and supported the bill. The exact date of Henry and Anne's marriage is uncertain, but it likely occurred between February 15th and 23. Chapais, the Spanish ambassador, reported that the wedding took place on February 23rd in the presence of Anne's family. The Archbishop-elect Cranmer was not involved, as he learned about the marriage later. By early March, Henry was confident enough to have preachers at court praise Anne and denounce his marriage to Catherine. On March 14th, Cromwell introduced the Bill of Appeals in the Commons, and on March 26th, Convocation was asked to rule on the validity of Henry's marriages. Meanwhile, Pope Clement VII approved Cranmer's appointment, and the archbishop was consecrated on March 30th. There were signs that the Earl of Wiltshire, Anne's father, was not entirely comfortable with the rapid changes. Duke Norfolk, who was opposed to Henry's actions, claimed that Wiltshire had supported him in blocking the marriage as early as May 1532. However, the Earl was swept along by events and had to support his daughter's new position. The months leading up to Anne's coronation on June 1, 1533, were marked by tension and controversy. The Duke of Suffolk and his wife, the king's sister, were openly unhappy, and the country was deeply divided. On May 23, the Archbishop's court at Dunstable declared Henry's first marriage to Catherine null and void. The Pope responded with a bull on August 8, demanding that Henry restore Catherine and repudiate Anne under threat of excommunication. Henry, in turn, appealed to a general council, citing the law of God and the Pope's unreasonableness. On July 5th, Henry issued a proclamation declaring Anne as the Queen of England and Catherine as the Dowager Princess of Wales. Catherine, however, refused to accept this, and was secretly supported by her household. Despite the political risks, Henry provided for Catherine as the Dowager Princess, but was cautious about enforcing the penalties for those who did not comply with his proclamation. On June 1st, Anne was crowned Queen in Westminster Abbey. The Duke of Suffolk appeared as High Constable, but the Duke of Norfolk was represented by his brother, Lord William Howard. The Earl of Wiltshire, Anne's father, was notably absent. The king deliberately excluded those closest to Anne from prominent roles to emphasize the support of those whose loyalty was less certain. The coronation was a controversial event, and many nobles stayed away. Chapais, who did not attend, mocked the ceremony, claiming that the people stood in silence and that half the nobility were absent. Despite the eulogies, the crowning of Anne was a contentious moment. In the days following the coronation, the Boleyn family celebrated, but the atmosphere was tense. The death of the king's sister, Mary, the Duchess of Suffolk, on June 24th did not dampen the festivities. On June 28th, Francis I's wedding gift, a splendid litter with 3 mules, arrived, further strengthening the alliance with France, although Francis was playing a double game. On August 26th, Anne went into confinement at Greenwich to await the birth of her child. Henry was anxious, given his experiences with Catherine, but on September 7th, Anne gave birth to a healthy daughter, Elizabeth. The disappointment was evident, but the parents hid their feelings and named the princess after Henry's mother. A magnificent christening was held on September 10th, with the Boleyn and Howard families prominently involved. Thomas Cranmer was the godfather, and several of Catherine and Mary's supporters were coerced into participating. Despite the grand ceremony, Elizabeth's birth was a setback for the Boleyns, and Anne's position, which had seemed secure in June, was now vulnerable. Chapais continued to deride Anne and Elizabeth, emphasizing the widespread support for Catherine and Mary. Henry, however, remained committed to his cause, knowing he had an uphill battle to win the hearts and minds of his subjects. In 1533, the battle for the English Reformation moved to Parliament. Early that year, the Act of Succession declared the marriage between King Henry VIII and his new wife, Anne Boleyn, as lawful and established their offspring as the rightful heirs to the throne. This was followed by the Treasons Act, which made it a crime to deny the king any of his titles, particularly that of Supreme Head of the Church. Both acts were drafted by Thomas Cromwell, a key figure in the king's court. The Earl of Wiltshire, Anne Boleyn's father, was involved in these proceedings, but his role seemed more passive. He was expected to approve the drafts and support them in the House of Lords, as was his duty as a councillor. The Treasons Act had significant consequences. In 1535, it was used to arraign John Fisher, Thomas More, and several Carthusian priors for their refusal to acknowledge the king's new titles. The Earl of Wiltshire was part of the commissions that tried these cases, and was present at the executions of the priors. This was a duty he could not avoid, and it may have been in anticipation of such responsibilities that he asked the great scholar Erasmus to write a treatise on preparing for death, a request made when the Earl was 57 years old. Anne Boleyn's influence was evident in the policies of 1533 to 1536, as documented by both foreign and domestic correspondence. She was a key leader in the family's political faction. In contrast, her father, the Earl of Wiltshire, appeared more in the shadows. Most records of his activities focused on his official roles as a councillor and Lord Privy Seal. Even his diplomatic duties seemed to have been taken over by his son, George. However, glimpses of his involvement still emerge. For instance, he joined the Duke of Norfolk in pressuring Anne Shelton, a kinswoman, for being too lenient with Lady Mary, whose defiance was a source of irritation to Anne. In June 1535, the Earl wrote to Thomas Cromwell, seeking his support in a complaint brought against him and his brother James by Leonard Spencer of Norwich. He believed Spencer's actions were malicious, though the details of the case remain unclear. In August of the same year, he requested a delay in an Irish parliamentary bill concerning the legitimacy of the Earl of Ossory's siblings. Despite this, a week later, he signed an instruction to the Lord Chancellor to process certain acts, including one that reversed a previous decision legitimizing the Earl's bastard siblings. This action was likely to protect the Earl's estate from collateral claims. In March 1536, the Earl secured a beneficial extension of his lease on the Crown Honour of Rayleigh, including his son George in the terms and reducing the rent. This suggests that Thomas Boleyn remained a favoured courtier until the very end, even as the king's relationship with Anne soured. However, tensions within the Boleyn faction were evident. Anne and her brother George were strong supporters of the evangelical movement, which aimed to reform the church. This aligned with the king's goal of establishing the royal supremacy. Anne was described by John Foxe as a great promoter of the gospel, though this did not make her a Lutheran. The Duke of Norfolk, on the other hand, found the spread of Protestantism unacceptable and supported the supremacy only if it was used to suppress heresy, which was Henry's initial intention. The Earl of Wiltshire's position seemed to align more with Norfolk's. He supported a fact-finding mission by Thomas Trebold in 1535 and 1536, which aimed to gather information on arrests and events in France and the reformers on the continent. Trebold's reports were directed to Cromwell, Cranmer, and the Earl of Wiltshire, suggesting that the Earl was seen as a potential patron of the reformers. However, the Earl's support for reform was limited. He patronized Robert Wakefield in the context of annulling the king's first marriage, but his promotion of reforming clergy was minimal compared to Anne's efforts. The Boleyn faction, while united in their goal of advancing Anne's position, was not without internal division. Anne and George were clearly in the evangelical camp, while their father was more conservative and followed the king's lead more closely. This difference in stance would become more apparent as time went on. The Boleyn faction's rise to power began in the summer of 1527, driven by two key developments: Anne's emergence as a potential queen and a decline in the king's trust in Cardinal Wolsey. The faction, led by the Duke of Norfolk, aimed to remove Wolsey from power. This group included the Duke of Suffolk and Lord Darcy, who were not particularly sympathetic to Anne's ambitions. Wolsey, aware of the threat, tried to maintain his position by emphasizing his indispensability to the king. Despite Anne's initial politeness towards Wolsey, the cardinal's failures, particularly the adjournment of the Legatine Court, led to his downfall. By 1529, the Boleyn faction, including Anne, her father, and the Dukes of Norfolk and Suffolk, was gearing up for a decisive move against the cardinal. Anne's shift from politeness to active opposition was gradual. She began to exercise her influence to bring about Wolsey's downfall, but her efforts were less critical than the cardinal's own mistakes. The failure of the Legatine Court and the diplomatic fiasco at Cambrai damaged Wolsey's standing. By September 1529, it was clear that Wolsey was losing favor, and the Boleyn faction was rising. The Earl of Wiltshire, despite his more conservative stance, remained a key figure in this political shift, though his role was often overshadowed by the more active and visible leadership of his daughter and her allies. The Cardinal Thomas Wolsey found himself in a precarious position. His only hope of redemption lay in a face-to-face meeting with King Henry VIII, but Anne Boleyn was determined to prevent this. Wolsey's attempt to travel to Cambrai in July was portrayed as a sabotage of the Legatine Court, a move to delay the annulment of Henry's marriage to Catherine of Aragon. He was accused of being in the pocket of Louise of Savoy, the Queen Mother of France, and of accepting large payments. These charges, along with old accusations of pride and vainglory, were used to undermine his position. In September, Wolsey was ordered to write to the king, outlining the topics for discussion. This was an unusual request, likely orchestrated by Anne and her allies to avoid surprises. Despite the tension, the interview itself, when it finally took place, did not seem particularly unusual to observers. The men met for hours, and Wolsey's allies, Thomas Tuke and Stephen Gardiner, showed no signs of deserting him. However, something must have convinced Henry that Wolsey was not serving him well, because by October 9th, Wolsey was charged with premunire in King's Bench, and a week later, he was stripped of the Great Seal. The king's change of heart was not immediately apparent, but it seems that Anne and her supporters, with their influence both in the council and through Anne's personal relationship with Henry, managed to persuade him that Wolsey had to go. Wolsey's enemies, according to George Cavendish, his biographer, had planned to attack him in Parliament but chose the charge of premunire instead, as it was more likely to succeed. Wolsey's fall from grace was a gradual process. His relationship with Henry had been strained since the failure of the amicable grant in 1525, and had become more noticeable by the summer of 1527. A minor incident involving the appointment of a new abbess at the nunnery of Wilton in 1528 further demonstrated Wolsey's vulnerability. When the king's sister-in-law, Anne Boleyn, tried to secure the position for her sister, Eleanor Carey, but Eleanor's unsuitability was revealed. Wolsey's nomination of the prioress, Isabel Jourdain, despite the king's order, led to a harsh rebuke from Henry. This incident, though small, may have contributed to Henry's growing doubts about Wolsey's reliability. After his fall, Wolsey remained at Esher, struggling to maintain his livelihood while the king and his council confiscated his possessions. Despite the plunder, Henry sent Wolsey rings and even his physicians, suggesting a lingering favor. In April 1530, Wolsey was allowed to retire to his diocese in the north, but his efforts to regain the king's favor through European contacts and negotiations with Pope Clement VII were intercepted. This was enough to tip the balance, and on November 1, 1530, Wolsey was arrested on charges of treason. He died on November 29, 1530, at Leicester Abbey, before he could face trial. With Wolsey gone, the coalition of interests he had held together began to unravel. The Duke of Norfolk, despite his growing dislike of Anne, continued to support her for his own benefit. However, other key figures, such as Lord Darcy and the Duke of Suffolk, withdrew their support. Sir Thomas More was appointed as the new Lord Chancellor, a move that indicated Henry's independence and his desire for a legal expert rather than a clerical chancellor. More, however, was not a friend of the Boleyns, and was fundamentally opposed to Anne's ambitions. The court and council became increasingly divided, with Catherine's supporters, including the Duke of Suffolk, the Marquis of Exeter, and the king's friend Nicholas Kerr, forming a strong conservative faction. The Archbishop of Canterbury, William Warham, also obstructed Henry's plans, though not openly. The Boleyns, on the other hand, had their own influential allies, including the Earls of Huntingdon and Sussex, the diplomat Sir Thomas Wyatt, and the rising star Thomas Cromwell. From the autumn of 1532 to the summer of 1533, the Boleyns experienced a period of significant success. Anne's strategic use of her sexuality and intelligence played a crucial role in her rise. She became pregnant, and Henry married her, appointing Thomas Cranmer as Archbishop to legitimize their union. The coronation and the christening of their daughter, Elizabeth, were triumphs for the Boleyns, who dominated the events and forced even Catherine's supporters to participate. One of Anne's notable victories was the suppression of Elizabeth Barton, a nun who had gained a reputation for her prophecies. Barton had warned Henry of dire consequences if he divorced Catherine and married Anne. In 1531, the Boleyns mobilized against her, and by 1534, she and her associates were arrested, tried, and executed as traitors. This purge of Catherine's supporters made it clear that any open support for the ex-queen would be considered treason. The Boleyns' success was deeply tied to Anne's influence over Henry. As long as Catherine remained a threat, Anne's position was secure. Henry had committed to his decision, and the Boleyns were the primary beneficiaries of this new political landscape. The tensions within the Boleyn party were significant. Anne Boleyn, by nature and political inclination, was strongly pro-French, but Francis I of France was determined to maintain good relations with Rome, which was a point of conflict. When Pope Clement VII excommunicated Henry VIII in September 1533, Henry reacted poorly, withdrawing his envoys from France. This reaction was counterproductive, as Francis had already done much to delay the excommunication. Anne, understanding the importance of Francis's support, did not instigate this outburst. However, Thomas Cromwell, who had a different view, arranged for the publication of a strongly anti-papal document that further strained relations with France. By early 1534, Cromwell persuaded Henry to send a mission to the Lutheran princes of Germany, hoping to find allies against the emperor. Anne's father, however, was displeased by this move, seeing it as a step towards heresy. Religion was another source of tension within the Boleyn party. Anne, influenced by her time in France, embraced evangelical ideas, which were more in line with Christian humanism than Lutheranism. She was particularly devoted to reading the scriptures in French, and later supported the translation of the Bible into English. Despite this, Anne's faith remained orthodox, and she was not accused of heresy. Her support for reform in the church, however, often put her at odds with her more conservative family members, such as her father and uncle, who were less enthusiastic about the king's break with Rome. The Earl of Wiltshire, Anne's father, was deeply unhappy with the king's actions, especially after Anne's pregnancy in 1533 forced the issue. He and the Duke of Norfolk, both powerful figures, gradually lost influence as Thomas Cromwell became the king's main advisor. Cromwell, aligned with Anne and her brother, Lord Rochford, pursued a more radical reform agenda, which further alienated the conservative faction within the Boleyn party. The Earl of Wiltshire, once a key supporter, began to fear that Anne's actions might lead to the family's downfall. Catherine of Aragon, despite being dismissed from court, remained a popular and respected figure. Her daughter, Mary, who was 17 in 1533, refused to accept her new status as the Lady Mary, and was placed in the household of the new princess, Elizabeth. This was a deliberate move to make Mary uncomfortable, and it succeeded. Mary's defiance, including her refusal to address Anne as queen and her insults during visits to Elizabeth, made her a focal point for the Aragon party, who saw her as a potential heir to the throne. Henry, despite his attachment to both his daughters, was forced to navigate these tensions carefully, especially as Anne and her allies were deeply apprehensive of Mary's potential threat. Catherine and Mary continued to communicate through loyal servants, despite the official prohibition. Henry may have allowed this to continue, possibly to maintain some level of family harmony. The Boleyn party, however, was increasingly divided, with Anne and her brother on one side, and their more conservative family members on the other. The shadow of Catherine and her supporters loomed large, and the political landscape remained volatile and unpredictable. In the end, the Boleyn party's unity was tested by the very issues that had brought them to power. Anne's influence, while significant, was not enough to overcome the deep divisions within her own family and the broader political pressures of the time. The king's intransigence on the annulment and his desire for a male heir, combined with the complex interplay of religious and political forces, set the stage for the dramatic and tragic events that would follow.